Hello, everyone. Welcome to the WookieCast. Today we're sitting down with Brandon Auman, the showrunner for Star Wars Resistance. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
Um, I'd love to get into what your first Star Wars memory is, because we're obviously all fans of the franchise itself.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm old enough to remember the original trilogy, watching it on VHS back in the day, and just being a massive fan of all things Star Wars. Having the toys, having like the books for kids. Just really, it was a huge influence on me, and basically on my career. Like, just it really kind of grew my love of science fiction, fantasy. You know all things fantastical and love of robots and collecting robots. But and I still collect Star Wars toys to this day. So I'm a huge nerd.
Do you remember the first one you saw in theaters?
The first one I saw in theaters as a kid was Return of the Jedi. So it just goes to show I'm very old.
Um, so you've had a lot of other credits before working on Star Wars Resistance, some in animation. How did you first get involved in Star Wars Resistance? Like when the talk started beginning and what was it like getting like what attracted you to this project?
I mean, basically being a massive fan of Star Wars definitely helped. I was actually I was showrunning TMNT at the time, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, for Nickelodeon. That was the 2012 version. And I was about to wrap up. I was working on a new version of TMNT, a follow-up version after the 2012. We were developing another version that I wrote a Bible for. I was basically creating it. And that project continued, but I left to work on Resistance. I got a call from Lucasfilm. I flew up to meet Dave Filoni and Carrie Beck and Kiri Hart and all these, all the great Lucasfilm execs. And I really hit it off with Filoni, who is just, a great guy and a amazing mentor. And we both have a huge love of Godzilla, so we spent a lot of time talking about Godzilla and the original Star Wars movies that we both grew up with. And we found that we had a lot of things in common, and we just hit it off really well. And from my understanding, like there was nobody else sort of in the running after I met Filoni. So
Oh, yeah.
so that was that was definitely a bonus. But yeah, and then from there, things took off pretty rapidly. Like this is right around the time of The Force Awakens. So this was like I think The Force Awakens was maybe even still in theaters at that time, if I remember correctly. So I think it was like maybe January, February of like 2016. Yeah, it must have been 2016. Thinking back, it's been a while.
That does make sense though, because some of the early concept art was like that you had to move really quickly because obviously the show was releasing during the time frame before The Last Jedi, I guess, mostly. So had to all kind of fit within that time frame.
Yeah, it
Um,
happened really fast.
so I wanted to get a bit into your vision for Star Wars Resistance. Obviously, there's a little bit of a different animation style compared to, I mean, we saw Clone Wars, Rebels, a little bit of a different animation style, and also one that doesn't have a lot of Force sensitives or Jedi. So I was curious what your vision was for introducing these characters that are lovable and sort of like a family vibe.
Well, a lot of it, I mean, obviously it wasn't just me. Like Filoni had a lot of ideas in mind, like early on. And Justin Ridge as well, who was essentially, the co-showrunner who was really helping to sort of pull this thing together. We really wanted to make something that felt like a family. Like, and we wanted to take it back to, we wanted to make something that was more accessible for kids because Filoni felt that like Rebels was getting kind of, it got kind of dark,
Dark.
like the first season was much lighter compared to obviously, like the subsequent seasons. Like it was a much sort of like, it kind of took a dark turn, which Star Wars tends to do. Like even Resistance to a degree got a little dark, like, going into the later, like later season one, but then also into season two. But we really wanted to make it, feel like this family that's on the that's together and really trying to stand up against fascism and this new threat of the First Order closing in and what it's sort of like for people on the outside who's not like necessarily like close to the galactic core. Like what are they doing, what are they up to, like when there's this sort of giant sort of like evil sort of movement that's suddenly rearing its head and starting to take over. So we really wanted to make something that was super accessible for younger kids but would also sort of really it can't it still has to work within the
Star
Star Wars
Wars.
universe. Yeah.
You're right about things getting dark though. Clone Wars later seasons were dark. I mean, I liked them, but I'm older. So, um, I thought it was really interesting with the whole family aspect because we obviously see Tam and her whole choosing to leave that family. How did the development for that character arc come about?
Um, it's interesting. Like we really wanted to, sort of. I was sort of pitching the idea that you know, Tam should be this sort of pivotal character who we can really, who's we sort of explore the universe through a sort of a flip in terms of like belief systems. I mean, like she is someone who is clearly a good person, but she feels that, especially with in some ways, like you can't really blame it on one specific thing, but she felt sort of, Kaz shows up, he kind of takes over. Now he's got the fireball, and like all of Tam's aspirations, she feels like are starting to kind of like die because, like now she doesn't have the fireball anymore. She's not really becoming the racer that she really wants to become. She doesn't really feel like she has this like like that she's not going anywhere. And we thought it was interesting if she was sort of seduced, not to the dark side, but to like just like a different point of view that obviously she wasn't, nobody really understood, the First Order at that time. The First Order was this sort of like emerging force. Clearly, it had ties to the Empire, but a lot of people in the galaxy didn't quite understand like what they meant, and that really they were just affording some people bigger opportunities to get out of like this little sort of like you know tiny little essentially like little station at the edge of the galaxy, like and to be somebody and to really have an impact and to sort of like live up to their potential. And Tam really felt like that was something that she could, as a way to get out of like it's like Luke wanting to get off of like Tatooine, but it's sort
Right.
of the reverse. So we thought that was just a really interesting, and it was a way to sort of like really make Tam feel more pivotal to the whole sort of like galaxy.
I did notice that she has like or at least her family has a sort of imperial background, so maybe she doesn't view everyone from the Empire as evil versus some would. Like Yeager is like, no, no, the Empire, they're terrible. But she's like, well, no, my grandfather worked in an imperial factory, so that's kind of interesting to see how that might have affected it. Um,
Absolutely. I mean, when some characters believe that the days of the empire, like when they worked in a factory or they had jobs coming because they're building starships and it felt like a more prosperous time. But and the truth of it is that they were building machines for war, and after that sort of collapse, then it becomes like so there were people who were on harder times, but when you look at the bigger picture, you realize that like there's definitely sort of a kind of a gray zone. And Tam didn't really understand that it's it was not really like her grandfather, her parents, that were employed by the Empire. It wasn't a good thing, but she didn't quite understand it. She wasn't alive during that time.
she was just young enough to know that it kept their family from starving. And
Exactly.
yeah. Um, one of the challenges that I noticed was because was set within such a jam-packed period of time, what was it like trying to jump through all the hurdles of making sure this doesn't conflict with anything else in the Star Wars canon?
That was tough. That was tough. Like
Can't use this character somewhere
yeah,
else.
yeah, there were many times where we couldn't use a specific character that we wanted to use. We tried to include, some legacy characters that didn't really work out. We There was an episode that we were going to have, Han Solo was going to be a part of it, and then that didn't quite work. Um, And then there were other characters that were a part of, the sequel trilogy that we wanted to get in there, and we had some plans for. And then, we lost a couple of episodes because, the parent company Disney sort of moved some uh, some things around in terms of like moving some money around, so that we actually, I think, a lot of animated series at that time sort of lost a few episodes. We lost a few episodes as well, as many other Disney shows did, because there was a whole sort of business aspect to, anyway, that's a longer story. But yeah, there was definitely some characters that we wanted to include that we didn't have a chance to, which was unfortunate. But we were happy with. I'm always happy creating new characters, for the Star Wars galaxy that will, hopefully, ring on in other media. And it has. There have been other characters that have been related, or we see other characters like in books or comics, or crossing over into, like, say, Ahsoka. There was, and that's always a great thrill of seeing how, like, the characters that we created got to live on, or
Yeager was just in this comic run that finished up, I think, last week, so still
very
appearing.
exciting. Yeah, yeah. And then you've got Hamato, who's in Ahsoka,
So good.
Kaz's father, which was really, really cool. And you got to see him originally in, obviously in different two seasons of Resistance. So that was a real thrill for us. So, it's just really cool how characters live on, or relatives of characters, are in different media, video games, comics, like you said. So it's a real thrill to see how, you create these characters and they kind of take on a life of their own, and they exist, and it almost feels like they're real.
Even some species, because I've seen Gaza start appearing outside of um, flicks, I guess, in
Yeah,
other media. So it's cool.
yeah, comics and stuff like that too. Yeah, absolutely.
Uh, One thing I noticed from a different interview, because I've seen some of the others, was Ventress one of the characters that was cut from some episodes? I know there's something about her, Mika Gray, that was floating around one point.
That's 100% true. Yeah, and that was actually Dave Filoni's idea, was to have, and he pitched all these amazing, ideas that would have, there was at one point, he talked about, well, what would happen if, like, he showed up on the Colossus. I mean, she showed up on the Colossus, and then something met Kylo Ren, and then there was this battle between Ventress and Kylo Ren that could have happened on the Colossus. I mean, sometimes, like, Dave sort of just goes off, and then we're like, is he joking here? Is he serious? But he was very serious. And for the longest time, um, Ventress was Nika Gray. Like, and I wrote that episode. And then Billy was looking at it, and was like, he just wasn't sure. He kind of went back and forth, and eventually was like, well, he was worried that it was going to sort of, like, what the problem is that when you bring in, Ventress is she's awesome. She's just such a great, uh, an incredible character, one of my favorites. So I was really bummed out, obviously, when we didn't include her. But I also understand his point. Once you bring in like a really big legacy character from, like, Clone Wars, then they kind of take over. Like, all the fans care about them is that particular character. Like, they're really coming back for Ventress, not for Kaz, not for Yeager, not for Mickey.
Right.
They're really coming back to see. And that's why you have to be very careful, like, how often you see, a lot of these classic characters, because then it's like the fans just want them, and then when they don't appear, then they get upset, or when it doesn't become about them. That's why, like, we were really hesitant to use any Jedi, because as soon as you have a Jedi character, you just want to follow that Jedi character, and that was something that Clone was definitely didn't want to do.
Kill and Isla, they had some kind of, it was alluded to that they're force sensitive much earlier on, but then that aspect was sort of dropped as the seasons went on. Was that intentional? Kind of in the same
Yeah,
aspect of force sensitivity taking the focus.
that's right. Yeah, we were like, it was just really tough. Like, I really sort of wanted to see a different aspect, a different side of the Force, and what these Force sensitive characters could do, and different sort of maybe a different religion based around, the Force, which they've actually explored in other, shows, other series, um, since Resistance, and comics and whatnot as well, and in novels. There's been a little bit more of that. But again, I think Filoni was just really concerned that, like, look, if we start, they're going to take over.
Yeah.
Like, how are
Yeah.
they going to take over? And then it's really going to become about how they become a Jedi-like figure or a Force sensitive, and then Kaz gets kind of left in the dust because then the audience will just kind of care about these characters, and so it was tough. Like we kind of like we had a lot more plans for them, and then they kind of fell by the wayside intentionally because it started feeling like they would begin to take over, and you know, the more we explored them. So I was a little bit, you know, there were times where I was a little bit bummed. I was like, well, I think we can do it and maintain the balance, but ultimately, you know, it
It
was
could have been
felt
the right call.
it could have been the right call. And we were doing so much with Kaz that it starts, there's just becomes like the characters, just too many characters and too many characters to follow. And then we really just wanted to sort of like home in on Kaz.
I know that was the thing with Lyra and Rogue One as well. They almost had her as a former Jedi, but then they were like, no, that would take the focus away. So I definitely
Exactly.
get that. But just out of pure curiosity, it's probably been long enough. Are there any aspects of those like Kel and Nyla's backstory that you would have included or that you thought about including, just as a behind the scenes sort of like trivia information? You remember?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we wanted to sort of explore them a little bit more in terms of like, you know, like what their religion was, how it sort of tied into like you know, like even sort of like, you know, elements of like sort of like a grayer zone. Like we kind of wanted to make the kids a little bit eerie at first, and we weren't quite sure, we didn't quite understand their connection to the forest and how it was a little bit more like not, it wasn't necessarily light side or dark side, but a little bit more in the middle. And also, you know, they potentially had, and this was included, and then it was sort of like removed. But even like, yeah, they had abilities as like healers, which I thought was really interesting. But then, you know, when you start making characters healers, then it sort of takes away from the
Yeah.
urgency. You know, like suddenly it's like, well, take them to Kel,
Then you can just
Kel,
be
no,
healed if you get
and
hurt,
they can be
which
healed
isn't really,
exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
and which was interesting because then that was sort of explored later, you know, in the sequel trilogy, um, you know, and I thought that was interesting. You know, the fact that Ray had that, you know, that ability was something that we had talked about before that script even existed. So we were developing that like really like pretty early on.
And so Kel and I were one of many, many new characters that you had to create for this. But obviously at the start you had to start creating these central pillars of characters like Kaz, Yeager, Captain Doza. What was it like just creating those characters from the initial? Because I'm assuming there wasn't any drafts or anything that you pulled them from. It's like developing an entire universe from scratch.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that was you know, all of our early discussions of at Skywalker Ranch were like just, you know, kind of figuring out who these characters were, what they meant to like the greater Star Wars galaxy, you know, who they were, what was their past. You know, like I really wanted to push the idea that like Cass came from money because generally, you know, most of the characters either come from sort of like poverty, like Luke, or like, you know, they have like a smuggler background, or they were part of, you know, like you know, they were part of, you know, the New Republic or whatever it was, like they were a part. But like I thought it was really interesting that like you take a character like Kaz, and it's interesting if he comes from privilege and from a wealthy background and who gets stuck in this place, this really blue collar place. You know, we thought that was an interesting sort of like different backstory. And now we're seeing a little bit more of that in the greater sort of Star Wars galaxy. But you know, we thought that was just an interesting sort of you know, backstory for Kaz. Yeager, you know, Yeager's backstory is a little bit more traditional, but it's that sort of classic sort of idea of like, you know, it's sort of the jaded, you know, ex-pilot, you know, who wants to sort of be left alone, doesn't want to be a part of like any wars anymore or any battles. Like he did it, he's done. He just wants to sort of like he wants to get away from like the New Republic and all, you know, it's not that he's like it's not that he doesn't care, but he was so wounded in his backstory um, that you know he
But
just
his
wants to get
brother
away
and
from
all
that.
that,
Yeah,
everything.
exactly. His brother, his family, and you know, the death of his wife and his kid. There's, you know, and it was a much sort of we had a lot darker sort of aspects of that we sort of stripped down and just sort of hinted at and alluded to. But we thought that was a really interesting sort of, you know, for it worked for Yeager, and then he also had a relationship with Poe. We thought that was interesting to tie it into you know the sequel trilogy. And then you know then you've got characters like you know, Sonara, who's like an ex pirate, and you know, then you've got like you know, you've got Tora and Niku and Tam, and Tam is really represents the working class. So it's like we really wanted to kind of make sure that all the characters were very, very different and had different backstories, and the way they all sort of related was like they start really, really coming together more and more as the as the First Order starts to emerge and sort of rear its ugly head, and then we start to see that yeah, this isn't over. Like the remnants of the Empire have sort of banded together, and like they're coming back, and and I remember like back in the day when the sequel trilogy came out, and people were like, what? How is the Empire coming back? But then we also see like even
Mm.
and like just modern politics, how it flip-flops back and forth, like this different sort of like all over the world, not just in America, but all over the world, how like politics will flip-flop, and we'll think that we're on this sort of like this streak, and then suddenly it changes again. Very much the Star Wars galaxy.
I mean, because Captain Doza was an ex-Imperial and
Yeah,
flipped, so the politics they change over time.
yeah, they change, and people's hearts change, and and I thought that was pretty interesting too, because you don't see many characters, at least at that time, like when we were developing, you didn't see many characters. I mean, Griff was another one of them, like so with the squadron, so it's like like ex Imperials who just sort of like they wanted to get out. Doza got out early, like he saw what was going on. He saw just how devastating the Empire's control was over the galaxy. He just decided to defect and get out. It was really his wife that helped him get out. And, so I'd love to, I
Hopefully, we get
love
to
their
see that
story.
story someday in a comic or
Yeah,
something.
I think that's one of the like one of the best, and just the idea of like, just the idea of like Venisa like pulling, Captain Doza out of, the Empire is just such a cool. It would make a really beautiful story. Hopefully, Lucasfilm will explore that one day in a book or comics.
So I was curious about some aspects of kind of like the backstory aspect of Tam and Yeager, because obviously he kind of views her as a daughter even before Kaz gets there. But they've obviously been on the Colossus for quite some time before he even arrives. So what was that kind of like? Because there's a lot of like hints to it almost of how much they cared for each other, but it's never fully stated, I guess, until more the end.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that there was probably even a bigger sort of like the Colossus in its heyday, even though there's a lot of races and there's a lot of betting and there's a lot of things going on there, Tam sort of made her way out to the Colossus probably when it was in its heyday, because I feel like it's a little bit on its decline when Cash shows up, and it became a little bit more of like less of a place to like, even though they're racing, they're still like, but it's still so out of the way, right? And Tam ended up there thinking that she was going to be able to race and hopefully, become successful, maybe even make a lot of money, and then maybe she ends up back at the like, like back at the Galactic Four, like maybe she goes to like she ends up on Coruscant or wherever, and she's going to be this big time racer, and she kind of got sort of stuck and sidelined there. And I think it was, and Yeager employed her and sort of promised her, quite a lot, like get the Fireball one day. Work for me, make some money, we can fix up some, like fix up the Fireball, whatever racer you're gonna be able to race. She's been there maybe like, I think not terribly long before Cass showed up, but maybe like a couple of years. And then maybe a little bit long, maybe like 2, 3 years, because Tam is fairly young, and I think that Yeager sort of essentially, yeah, like almost adopted her away, like kind of really became his father figure. And I think that his concern in terms of his family and just how dangerous racing is, I think he sort of intentionally kind of kept her grounded out of fear, fear of what
That
happened to
something would
his
happen to her.
that
Yeah.
something would happen to her. Like he took the more he liked her and took a shine to her and like really wanted to sort of help her, but at the same time just kind of made it more difficult for her to like he probably knew that like the Fireball wasn't really that, it's going to take a long time and not, this is going to be a ship that is not going to be easy to repair. And it's always going to be sort of like grounded for the most part. And it's not really a race-worthy vehicle. I think that he really sort of intentionally, yeah, you can have the Fireball knowing that it wasn't going to be like an easy fix and that, and expensive and difficult. And not a race-worthy vehicle. Like he sort of like assigned her that ship so that he could kind of make sure that she didn't race and get into a horrible accident. And then, the more he wanted to sort of like care for her and he really just saw her as like she should be a mechanic. It's safe. It's like, which is I mean, her path and her destiny is her own. And I think she also resented that over the years. And then Cass shows up and then he starts fixing and flying the Fireball. She really resented
And
that. And
crashing
she's
it
like
repeatedly.
and crashing it repeatedly and having to fix it again and again and again. And she resented that, and that's the main reason why she decided to join the First Order. Ultimately, was that to finally get off the platform and just get out and just fly, because that's what she really wanted to do. Ultimately, she was a great mechanic, but she really wanted to fly. So we thought that was sort of an interesting sort of story that we sort of hinted at. And you kind of gather that was sort of what was going on. You could really sort of get a sense that he truly cared for her and was just worried that she was going to get into a terrible accident. Um,
In contrast,
and
Niku seems very happy as a mechanic. So
oh yeah, no, he's found his path. He's happy. He's doing what he loves to do the most. Like I really wanted to sort of make a character that felt sort of very relatable. I feel like to many people, in terms of like wearing his heart to the honestly, being very, like he's sort of very. He has like his focuses and his interests and his love, and he's just such a good soul. And we really wanted to create a character that was just a purely good soul who was like, selfless and you know just a good guy all around, somebody that you would like to know and be friendly with.
I guess I guess that's kind of why it hurt him so much when Nina didn't have good intentions and she kind of duped him into saying, "Oh, I really like you. I'm telling you all these stories about myself, but I'm part of the First Order."
Yeah, yeah, that was pretty painful for him. And that was probably the first time that he sort of had his eyes open, in terms of like trusting someone, wholeheartedly, and then just sort of being, betrayed. And she felt, I think, terrible as well. But they were, she essentially sort of, exploited him to a degree, unfortunately. But I feel like, she part of it still cared about him. She just was doing a job, and it's so unfortunate. Poor Niku, had his
Yeah.
heart broken.
Um, there's also kind of just a lot of other characters within the classes that take very recurring roles. Like you see Flix and Orca just kind of in the background a lot doing their thing. Um, was there any inspiration for their shop and all the stuff there? Because there's quite a lot of episodes that feature their little acquisition store and everything.
Yeah, we just wanted to, we thought that would just be interesting to have like these kind of like these cool little unique alien characters who were in this like really fun relationship, and and they're also very savvy, and we wanted to we were hoping to even include another episode or two if we could that would highlight them even more. It got tough because of the sheer amount of characters, but they're so fun, and it was just great. Like Bobby Moynihan, getting to cast him, as Orca was just so much fun, and he became a friend, and he's a legitimate Star Wars fan, like huge lover of Star Wars. Kind of guy who builds his own droids. Um, he's just a massive fan, and he knows an incredible amount of trivia, and so we'd have fun just talking behind the scenes about Star Wars and all the things that we love. Yeah, Bobby became a good friend, and just working with him on that because he was always so full of enthusiasm. He even had custom toys of Fix and Orca that were made. That I thought was just so cool. And he even sent me Star Wars toys, which I thought was such a cool thing to do. And just a great guy all around. So it was so much fun getting to work with him on that.
I will say that the one episode where they visit Flix's family, it's so hard to tell which of his cousins is speaking which line. They all sound the same.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That was the fun part. Yeah. It's sort of hard to like sort of figure out who is who, but but that was a fun episode, and and also getting to use any kind of like crate like dragon, um, monster was a blast, and getting to do almost a sort of like we really wanted to do a kind of like a preview planet. We wanted to have a dragon monster, like alien monster, a part of it, and we wanted to really fit the sort of that barren mining world. And we were trying to figure out how can we got to like tie in some of our characters to this world. So we thought, oh, it'd be great to just have Flix. Like, maybe this is Flix's planet. It's a mining planet. And it's just it was just really fun.
Do you remember any of the other episode ideas that you might have had for them if they had managed to make it in?
we wanted to like, yeah, boy, that's a good question. I know we tossed around a bunch of ideas. We wanted to explore maybe more of like Orca's past as well. We just sort of like, it just got tough because of, especially going into season two, like, and they were on the move. It was tough. It's like we don't want to visit too many planets of our characters just because it starts feeling convenient or it starts feeling like a little safe. You know what I mean? We go to a planet where we're sort of more familiar with our character's planet. It just became it became a little like it just got it was just hard, like because we really needed to stay on,
And
we
each
really
planet
needed.
probably has a lot of animation work because there were so many of them. There was the mining planet, Varkana, Celsor 3, many planets that we
Yeah,
developed for.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was really tough, and it was but it was fun, like for me again, the best part of it was like creating new characters and creating, new planets and visiting planets that maybe like, that were talked about and some like, if it was the old RPG or if it was like, old some of the novels, the books that were out of canon, and just sort of bringing those elements back in. We always had fun doing that. Like that was one of the best parts of like, the Resistance.
Did you ever consume any Star Wars Legends media in your youth that you were like fond of and you're like, oh, I can finally look at these and see if there's anything that fits back in?
It was tough because like we had to be sort of careful in terms of like including and bringing in too much because like
Right,
Filoni was actually more of like interested in like saying, well, just invent something new and something
right.
like so we did a lot of that too. We also invented like a lot of new worlds, just because it's always a little bit easier. But for me, I liked it more because then getting, hoping or actually seeing how those worlds spread out and then, another media, like that was always like, I think one of the more exciting aspects of working on the show. Just getting to invent new things.
Yeah, for sure. And then, I mean, even with the Aces, all of their ships have different features down to the details. There's a lot of different, just smallest details. Um, and a lot of them can be found on the concept art, which I think is really interesting. Um, one question that one of our editors had was Elric von Reg from the first season is named very similar to a character named Havina von Reg. Is there any familial connection to them between them?
Um, well, I don't know if it's officially been made canon, but I mean, my understanding is that, that Elric von Reg is her son. So because I believe that Havina's brothers, maybe even most of her family, or at least like maybe it was her brothers and maybe just some immediate cousins, something like that. A lot of them died.
Yeah,
So to me, it makes the most sense that Hamida, son is Alec Von Rag. Of course, he's a pilot. She was a pilot. And I was excited when, she was introduced to me when I was like, when they told me, like, oh, we're going to have, a member of the Von Rag family part of this game. And I was super excited about that just because, yeah, they're definitely related. To my mind, he is, her
percent.
son. Yeah. I mean, to me, that makes the most sense. But I mean, I don't know if that's officially been, I
Of
don't think that's
course.
officially been included in canon, but to my mind, yes, he's her son.
A lot of those First Order characters, they have very mysterious backgrounds because obviously we see Tierney, she only barely mentions her past. She just says, I was struggling during the time of the New Republic, and she doesn't address it again. Those characters must be pretty complex. Um, I don't know if there was ever any exploration or thoughts of exploring into their backgrounds, so if there was the time.
Yeah, we definitely discussed Tierney, and we're not sure exactly if Tierney is lying about her past, if
Uh,
she was really, like, was she struggling or was she just trying to figure out a way to get in there with Tam, knowing Tam, the psychology of Tam and trying to figure out what makes her relatable to Tam. We kind of kept her, purposely mysterious so that, you're not quite sure, what her deal is. I think if at all, if there was any, and maybe she was telling the truth. To my mind, like she probably was to a degree because, once the New Republic took over after, the fall of the Empire, like, if she had any relationship, if her relations, maybe her parents or her grandparents were a part of the Empire, and maybe that's why she was struggling. But we really wanted to keep her sort of mysterious and not quite, define too much of her backstory. But I mean, she's such a manipulative, kind of, like she's, not, she's definitely evil in that in the sense that she's working for the First Order, and that she's extremely manipulative, and she definitely has a cool streak. But I always think that those types of people they do come from some sort of tragic, past, and that's why they are the way they are. So my feeling is probably like her family was probably largely in ruins after the fall of the empire, and that she was trying to kind of like maybe she even tried to work her way through the New Republic, and maybe she was discovered
Just
as
wasn't working. Yeah.
and it wasn't working for her, and that and then once she discovered that the First Order was on the rise, and she remembered her family was connection, or was very aware of her family's connection to the Empire, that she started to you know she started to get a little bit more interested in what the First Order, because the First Order is like it just as it's emerging, it's not just emerging in one place. It's like sort of emerging in various places throughout the galaxy, and then it starts coming together, and you have these ex-Imperials, but then you also have people who are disillusioned by the New Republic, and they think it's not working, it's interesting, like what their sort of like what their ideologies are, and how they sort of conflict with what we would believe, the New Republic being this beneficial, you
But it
know,
also had a lot of flaws, so that's
it did have a
probably
lot of
why.
flaws. It
Yeah.
had many flaws. Yeah, I mean, as all as every sort of like government has, doesn't matter what aspect of it, there's always flaws everywhere. So when it comes to a system.
The dynamic between her and Pyre was interesting too. They kind of, I'm not sure if they were almost equals, or because they almost seemed equals in some regard because they just had different ranks. But also his armor reminds a lot of Phasma's almost from the sequel trilogy. Just kind of that shiny type of armor, which was
Oh yeah.
interesting. But is there anything you remember about designing his character? Because that's a really striking, just fully gold suit, I guess.
Yeah, I mean that was Filoni's idea. He wanted to go with like black and gold. I think that's like a Pittsburgh Steelers thing, so that's probably was very appealing to Filoni. Um, but also just the idea that like he thought it would just be interesting to see what a gold stormtrooper looked like, and how that design is, and it kind of like
And with the
it doesn't
matching blaster
necessarily.
and all that as well.
Yeah, he was very color coordinated. Like he, and when he showed up, we wanted to make him special. We wanted to make him interesting, and somebody that felt like they fit very much in like the sequel trilogy era. So we thought it would just be really cool, and to kind of really, and he initially, I don't think, if I remember correctly, wasn't going to be, at first a big part of it, but we liked his design so much, and we really wanted to keep him around. And tyranny is just sort of a different. They are equals to a degree. Like tyranny was given a lot of power. After Pyre, there was a few Pyre mess ups, and so tyranny was given probably more power than maybe she would typically, have, a little bit more rank than she would normally have, mainly because of some of Pyre's failures, but also, so they did work together, and Pyre at times sort of did listen to tyranny out of his own fear of Kylo Ren, and what could happen if
And then they did ultimately have that one really striking scene where they're forced to hold their guns against each other. I thought that was really interesting. Like a
that
power
was the
struggle.
yeah, that was the darkest part of but it kind of sums up the relationship in a way, right? Like both holding a blaster at each other. And that was one of the darkest parts of the entire series, which I thought was interesting. We got kind of a little bit darker, I think, by season two, especially toward the end of season two. It's funny, like on a show like Resistance, you think of it being sort of lighter for kids, but then there were also still ships being destroyed. There were Star Destroyers just being
The
wiped
Guavian
out.
Death Gang chasing after people, wanting to kill
Yeah,
them. Like,
Death Gang. You actually have a Death Gang. Yeah, exactly. There was a lot of the fear of death, and that's always like just a part of that's the intrinsic part of Star Wars. Like you've got that fear of death, of being taken over, or being like or being imprisoned or being destroyed. Like no matter, even if it's like geared more for kids, there's got to be a real physical threat, a real danger, which I think that and even in season one, even the racing, like you could die. Like
you
you
could
do that,
technically
you die.
crash, I guess, and
Yeah,
die.
yeah, Yeah, and they very much like even talk about that or early on in season one. You know, if you do this, you know, there's a good chance you're not going to come back. Um, you know, so and that was always, you know, really, really fun and interesting.
I thought it was really interesting how everyone also banded together there at the end to fight against the First Order. I guess they could have fled, really. They probably, I mean, some people probably did want to flee, but they didn't. How did that all come about? Was that like the big hurrah moment in case there wasn't a season three?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we were aware that, you know, we were only going to do two seasons. So we were trying to figure out how to like, but always with the possibility of maybe there's a, you know, a back door, maybe we're going to get a season three. But even going into season two, we were aware that like, you know, probably only going to do two seasons because we weren't sure, you know, and nobody at the time knew what was going to happen to Star Wars after the sequel trilogy. So we were like, and there was a concern that like, you know, if we do another season, it's going to come out like a year or two after,
Right.
well, you know, the last movie, and it was just like, well, where's it going to go? And then and are fans going to stick around if like the sequel trilogy is over, and then we're going to keep going? Like it felt it could work with like a with the Clone Wars or Rebels because you know that was like that was clearly those you know like especially with Rebels that was clearly you know designed to be after you know the original trilogy, which was you know decades you know in the past. But this was sort of living at the same time of the as the series, and it was just a whole sort of different can of worms. It was just a different kind of like you
Did you
know
have any ideas for if you were offered a third season, though, like what they might have gone and done?
well, you know, I think it would have been interesting to. I had a few ideas, you know, if it was like even like one of the ideas was that you know, and we talked about it. Like we actually had meetings with Lucasfilm and we discussed it. Like if it was going to be like a new series altogether that wasn't necessarily called Star Wars Resistance, but it would take place a few years in the future with an older Taz and an older Torah. Like those would be the two characters that would focus on the most. We'd see other characters like you know Yeager but it would really focus more on like you know, Torah and Kaz and being a part of like, you know, like essentially like the, you know, the new Republic, I guess, and really and seeing how we're sort of like, you know, trying to get the galaxy back on track after the fall of the First Order. But it was again, it's just tough because it's like, you know, you can't
We
get
don't
too
know if
far
a
ahead
bigger
of like
project wants to take over that, like the Ray movie might want to explain all of that, not a TV show, I guess.
exactly. Exactly. And it gets hard. It just gets difficult to sort of like, you know, and we were at sort of a time where like, you know, we knew that, you know, obviously the Mandalorian was happening. Because Dave was like, you know, he would go from like the set of the Mandalorian would fly back, like, you know, like he would be on the set of the Mandalorian for the first few days, then would fly back to up north to Lucasfilm. You know, and he would spend like a couple of days up at Lucasfilm up in you know San Francisco with us, and you know he was. I don't know how he did it. Like the poor guy. Like I felt so bad for him. He was like I think it was like perpetually exhausted, but somehow he had always had energy and like. But there were times where I would like you know I would talk to him. And I could just tell it was just like he was
He
like
was tired.
he was tired. He was burning it you know at both ends, and I don't again still don't know how he did it. I don't know how he does it. He like doesn't sleep much and he's just, you know, a creative genius, so he can just keep going. But you know, he wasn't even sure if the Mandalorian was going to be a success. Like back then, like he just wasn't sure. Like
And the
nobody
Clone Wars
knew.
season 7 wasn't out either. So
No, that wasn't
just a lot of
out,
stuff was not out.
and there was a lot of stuff going. And so it was a sort of a nebulous time in you know in Star Wars creation and like where things were going, and we just never really you know. So it was tough, and we had pitched a lot of different Justin Ridge and I pitched a lot of different Star Wars animated shows that we thought could live. One was very similar to Skeleton Crew, very similar.
Hmm.
Like before Skeleton Crew, I'm sure was even pitched. We had a very similar pitch where it was like a group of like young people and like older people who get kind of lost. It's kind of like a lost in space, and they got lost in like wild space essentially, and then they end up on the other side of it, and they were in a different galaxy altogether. And then we pitched we pitched everything from like a series with Luke you know training like you know young Ben Solo and all these young Jedi which we thought was a great idea you know before Ben Solo became Kylo Ren we pitched you know another series that was just based on Lando before Lando you know even met Han We pitched a lot of, and we pitched that, we pitched that Kaz and Tora series, which we thought we got pretty close, or at least we thought we were going to get pretty close. And then we pitched some things that were even non-Star Wars that we thought were interesting. We really tried to kind of, but nothing really came together. And again, it was a time where it was,
Very
Lucasfilm and Star
nebulous
Wars
time.
were
And you said some
crossroads.
episodes got cut that were they like
A
far
couple
into
of episodes,
production
yeah.
or were they just story concepts by that point?
No, they were full scripts. We actually had full scripts, and they were some of our favorite scripts, but they were more standalone, and they weren't necessarily, because most of the scripts that we then went with by the end of it were very much like a part of, like, they were needed, like they were very much a part of the arc, the entire, like season two arc. And then some of the standalones that we didn't get in there was like we explored Amica Gray episodes. So we got more of her backstory, and it was focused on her
Was it the
and
one
not,
with Maz that I've heard you
yeah.
mention and some others? Yeah.
That's right, with Maz. Yeah, and that was a great episode, and that involved like a Jedi relic. They had to like essentially break into a this giant starship, like almost like almost close to the size of like I don't know if it was either a Star Destroyer or it was a ship that was almost as big as a Star Destroyer, and it was like I'm trying to recall now if it was like an ex-Imperial ship, but it was a ship that had a Jedi relic. I believe it was almost like, well, it was a book or a text, a Jedi text that was in a vault, and it was a protected vault with various traps around it, and it was a ship that got um, it was caught in the orbit of a star. And it was slowly moving toward the star. It was going to be destroyed, and so this Jedi relic was going to be obliterated, and they had to break in there. And it was something that Maz asked Mika Gray's help for, and then Chaz ended up coming with. And they got it the last second. They retrieved it. And then Maz is going to give it to Ray at the very end. And that was an
Oh, to
episode.
Ray, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a part of the text that she was studying. So that was one of them. And then the other one was, if I remember correctly, it was a bounty hunter episode, and it was and I think it utilized. Well, it's been a few years now. I think it utilized uh members of Kaz's family. And if there was a season three, we were going to bring more of Kaz's family into it. We are going to get to see Hamato's relationship with the First Order and how he was sort of really working for the First Order in season three. And it was more out of necessity than him just being a bad guy. He just
So he would
thought,
have like worked with them to stay alive and not get executed, I guess.
to a degree, but then he was building starships for the First Order. He was playing it from both sides, a little bit like the Last Jedi. The idea that, like, corporations were sort of working for, starship builders were sort of working for both sides. There was no, it was a gray zone. He was more in the gray zone, leaning toward the darkness, and that he even wanted to he was even a part of like a First Order plot we had discussed to bring Kaz in, and then they were going to try and essentially convert Kaz, and his father was going to talk him into a winning team, because it seemed like, you know, Hamato knew of what, the Emperor was going to return, and that it was just, there was no way out of it, that the resistance was definitely going to be destroyed, and that the First Order was going to take over. So it was more like Kaz's father saying, "Look, this is inevitable. We've got to do something. I don't want to lose you. You're my son. I want you to live through this. And the only way you're going to do that is if you work for the First Order. That's the only way they're going to
And you
forgive
become
you."
a double spy of some sort and like save your
Yeah,
skin that way.
exactly. He would become like a double agent, and of course, Kaz is not going to do that. And but his family was essentially, he had to oppose his family, and that would have been like the bigger arc of season three, which we thought was really interesting. But that was something that we discussed. So if there was a
If there
possibility of season
were,
three,
yeah.
there was a backdoor, but that was all just early discussion.
And then his family, do we see any of his other family members or would have been primarily focused on his father, I'm supposing?
Well, we would have yeah, we would have also focused. We would have met his mother. We would have met his older sister. And yeah, essentially it would have been those characters that we would have met, and we would have seen that, all of them are now sort of affiliated with the First Order out of sheer need to survive, which
I
would
do
have been,
have to ask out of
yeah.
curiosity because I know my friend will want me to ask. Are there any other cut episodes that you remember anything about? Because they would love to know.
I mean, yeah, the bounty hunter episode um was gonna be an Axe Tagrin episode. Like Axe would have come back and he
Ooh.
would have been a bigger badass and he would have taken over the Colossus. Like he it was a pretty big like he really came off as like a bigger threat in that episode. Like actually showed up, gotten onto the Colossus while they were flying and really sort of taken over and got very close to delivering them to the First Order. It would have been a pretty pivotal. Well, yeah, that's the thing. It it just became, you know, an
It
episode
wasn't
that
tied to the central arc as
exactly.
much. Right.
It wasn't tied to the central arc, and even though it was like, you know, a very sort of like harrowing, very thrilling, super exciting, action-packed episode, it just didn't necessarily need to be there in the long run. But it was very cool, and you know, um, I really like the Axe character. I think his design was awesome. I've seen some really cool custom toys based on him that I think is really cool, and I love his like his exploding vibro axe. I thought it was really neat. So,
And
but
even though we
that
didn't see him again, we saw Norath again
yeah,
later on, which was nice because they
yeah,
originated from that Verkana episode. So,
yeah. So that was very cool too. So you know, getting to bring in characters and you know, getting to and always getting to invent characters is just like the most fun aspect of looking at Star Wars.
Vanessa was a pretty complex character that appeared mostly later on as well.
Mhm.
So, how did that come
Yeah,
to be? Because I know Tora had a lot of grief over her mother not being around, I guess, for her birthday that one time.
yeah, and yeah, like Venice is interesting because you know we really wanted to have a character who we you know we wanted to really explore who what happened to like you know Doza's wife, Tora's mom, and we really wanted to like kind of bring her in and sort of say that well it's not like they had a divorce or she died. You know, it's the classic sort of story of like there's one of your parents is you know dead or whatever, or both of your parents are dead in Star Wars. There's a lot of that. So we really wanted to have, and they're not necessarily divorced either, maybe separated only because she had like a mission, you know, she's very much a part of, you know, like the resistance now. And so even though they were sort of separated, you know, there was this
They
idea
still
that
loved each other.
they still loved each other and they still kind of wanted to be, you know, they wanted to be together and they were together at times, but it was more of like, you know, we can only really be together maybe after this crazy war ends and you know, Vanessa had a mission to do, she had a job to do. And I thought that she was just such a cool character and such a badass. And really in some ways, you know, like even though Tora looks up to her father as well for all the hard choices he had to make, I think Tora really looked up to her, and Tora obviously looked up to her mom, which I thought was really interesting and really cool. She's the badass. She's the one who's going out and flying. You know, it's a little bit of like you know, a little bit of a role reversal, you know, like, which I thought was interesting, you know, and different, and she's just a very cool character, and hopefully we'll get to see more of her, you know,
Hopefully, yeah.
in the Star Wars galaxy. Fingers
Are there any
crossed.
elements of resistance that you've like taken forward into your other projects, just inspired by things that you're able to, you know, create during that process?
You mean in terms of
Just like anything that inspired you during the creation of Resistance that you've taken forward, like, oh, this element was that you've tucked into other shows that's kind of made its way into popular culture.
well, I think that, you know, like I think it's probably more of like in terms of like what I learned about like character and what I learned about like, you know, the complexity of characters and what you can really, you know, explore, even in like if it's a kid's show or even if it's just a show for adults, like after Star Wars, then I'm, you know, show running Legend of Vox Machina, which is in an Amazon series. Um, and it was really more of like just how I sort of explore characters and really kind of keep the characters, you know, in a more sort of like, you know, in a complex, emotionally complex and 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 also just sort of morally complex sort of way. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah, for sure.
it's kind of like you know, a lot of kid shows. I think we were a very rich show in terms of characters, and character complexity. Like a lot of kid shows are just very straight on. Most kid shows are just very straight on, very black and white, very good and evil, very sort of like. But I think that like we, you know, really try to kind of like get into the complexity of the characters and their emotions and their moral compass and what they are, who they are and how they change. Like Tam, you know what I mean? Or even Kaz to a degree. Like Kaz really changed, I think, over the two seasons. And he would have changed even more if he would have done, further seasons. But I think that's to me what I really sort of carried over into other shows I've worked on. It's just sort of like the complexity of characters that sort of the emotional, like the complex emotional aspects of these characters and how to make them richer and how to, really sort of give them life and sort of at times you can keep them in a gray zone. I think is
Yeah.
really interesting.
Because like morality can be gray. There's never, I mean, there is right and wrong to a degree, but there's also a lot of gray.
Yeah, right and wrong is based on, essentially really just your perspective, like your allegiance to like a certain doctrine and dogma, and that, if it's the first order doctrine or dogma, if it's Republic or resistance, it's like, you know what I mean? Like the bad guys are always on the other side, to the first order, like the bad guys are these essentially they see them almost as like terrorists. The resistance are almost like a terrorist organization, and they really want to come back to restore order to the galaxy. They want to like really, like there's too much with pirates, there's craziness, there's like a lot of uncertainty, and they were like, we want to, like, crack down and make the universe, the galaxy safe, whatever that means, so to them, the bad guys are the resistance. Obviously, the resistance sees the first order as the bad guys, and that they're like this new, this it's their empire all over again. It's fascism all over again. It's the idea that we're gonna like lose our freedom and we're gonna have to, and it's all about conformity. So it's interesting, and that always applies to, I think, modern day, to our reality. Like seeing like who is the good guy and who is the bad guy. It's all based on your own personal perspective and ideology.
Do you have any upcoming or currently ongoing projects that people should keep an eye out for?
I do. I wish I could talk about them. They're all they're kind of secret right now. I would probably get in trouble if I mentioned most of them. But I have some feature projects that we're working on, live action stuff. A couple of projects that I'm directing, some live action movies that I'm directing. I wish I could talk more about them. Some animated projects in the works that I can't
Makes
mention or
sense.
discuss. But yeah, yeah. But you can, like fans can always follow me on Instagram. Pretty easy to find. Brandon Auman on Instagram, and I tend to post a lot, mostly a lot of stories and stuff like that. But yeah, like if you want to know, you can always sort of follow me on Instagram.
Yeah, thank you so much for sitting down with us. Because Wikipedia has always been a big fan of Resistance. I think we have about 25% of the articles from the series done, which
Oh,
is
wow.
higher than almost any other animated series. Um,
Very cool.
but yeah, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And
Uh, Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure talking to you. And yeah, I love talking about resistance. So anytime.